and thank all of you for being here and for making my short time in Delray so much fun and so meaningful as well. It was great to see a room full of people who love poetry, also love dance as much as poetry, and I think able to do it just as well. I sort of feel like I have the moves like Jagger, and that's where I'd like to begin. I know many of you were here yesterday, and I thank you also for that. And what I think that allows me to do in some ways is to read with a little bit less commentary than I might otherwise. I feel like you heard a lot of me doing that yesterday. I'm going to read from Thrall tonight, the book that Shard and I were talking about. And I just want to say that the book begins with a pair of epigraphs, the first from Robert Penn Warren, and the second in conversation with it from T.S. Eliot. What is love? One name for it is knowledge. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Illumination. Always there is something more to know. What lingers at the edge of thought, awaiting illumination, as in this second-hand book, full of annotations, daring the margins in pencil, a light stroke as if the writer of these small replies meant not to leave them forever, meant to erase evidence of this private interaction. Here, a passage underlined. There, a single star on the page, as in a night sky, cloud-swept and hazy, where only the brightest appears, a tiny spark. I follow its coded message, try to read in it the direction of the solitary mind that thought to pencil in a jagged arrow. It is a bolt of lightning. Where it strikes, I read the line over and over as if I might discern the little fires set, the flames of an idea licking the page, how knowledge burns. Beyond the exclamation point, its thin agreement, angle of surprise, there are questions, the word why. So much is left untold. Between the printed words and the self-conscious scrawl, between what is said and not, white space framing the story, the way the past, unwritten, eludes us. So much is implication, the after-image of measured syntax, always there, ghosting the margins that words, their black-lined authority, do not cross. Even as they rise up to meet us, the white page hovers beneath, silent, incendiary, waiting. I began writing this book by looking at the Mexican casta paintings. And the Mexican casta paintings in the 18th century across colonial Mexico represented the mixed blood unions that were taking place in the colony. They were done in series of 16. They always began with the white Spaniard father and showed the various blood mixtures, the different father and mother and child combinations. I was taken by them because not only were the families represented in this way, but the taxonomies, the various names created to name the various blood mixtures, were also printed right there on the paintings. I was also interested in the idea that in many ways stays with us today, that indigenous blood over a few generations could be purified back to whiteness, but that the taint of African blood was irreversible. So you had names like mulatto returning backwards, hold yourself in midair, and I don't understand you. If you were born a casta, your name was recorded at birth in the book of castas. This is after a series by Juan Rodriguez Juarez, circa 1715. Taxonomy. 1. De Español y de India produce mestizo. The canvas is a leaden sky behind them, heavy with words, gold letters inscribing an equation of blood. This plus this equals this, as if a contract with nature or a museum label, ethnographic, precise. See how the father's hand beneath its crown of lace curls around his daughter's head. She's nearly fair as he is, calidad. See it in the brooch at her collar, the lace framing her face. An infant, she is borne over the servant's left shoulder, bound to him by a sling, the plain blue cloth knotted at his throat. If the father, his hand on her skull, divines, as the physiognomist does, the mysteries of her character, discursive, legible on her light flesh, in the soft curl of her hair, we cannot know it, so gentle the eye he turns toward her. The mother, glancing sideways toward him, the scarf on her head, white as his face, his powdered wig, gestures with one hand a shape like the letter C. See, she seems to say, what we have made. The servant, still a child, cranes his neck, turns his face up toward all of them. He is dark as history, origin of the word native, the weight of blood, a pale mistress on his back, heavier every year. 2. De Español y Negra produce mulatto. Still, the centuries have not dulled the sullenness of the child's expression. If there is light inside him, it does not shine through the paint that holds his face in profile, his domed forehead, eyes nearly closed beneath a heavy brow. Though inside, the boy's father stands in his cloak and hat, it's as if he's just come in or that he's leaving. We see him transient, rolling a cigarette, myopic, his eyelids drawn against the child passing before him. At the stove, the boy's mother contorts, watchful, her neck twisting on its spine, red beads yoked at her throat like a necklace of blood, her face so black she nearly disappears into the canvas, the dark wall upon which we see the words that name them. What should we make of any of this? Remove the words above their heads, put something else in place of the child, a table perhaps upon which the man might set his hat, or a dog upon which to bestow the blessing of his touch, and the story changes. The boy is a palimpsest of paint, layers of color, history rendering him that precise shade of in-between. Before this, he was nothing, blank canvas, before image or word, before a last brushstroke fixed him in his place. 3. De Español y Mestiza produce castiza. How not to see in this gesture the mind of the colony? In the mother's arms, the child hinged at her womb, dark cradle of mixed blood, call it Mexico, turns toward the father, reaching to him as if back to Spain, to the promise of blood alchemy, 3 easy steps to purity. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and a Spaniard, a castizo. From a castizo and a Spaniard, a Spaniard. We see her here, 1 generation away, nearly slipping her mother's careful grip. 4. The Book of Castas. Call it the Catalog of Mixed Bloods, or the Book of Not Spaniard, not white, but mulatto returning backwards, or hold yourself in midair, and the Morisca, the Lobo, the Chino, Sambo, Albino, and the No te entiendo, the I don't understand you. Guidebook to the colony, record of each crossed birth. It is the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, that which can be purified, that which cannot. Canaan's black fate. How like a dirty joke it seems. What do you call that space between the dark geographies of sex? Call it the taint, as in it taint one and it taint the other. Illicit and yet naming still what is between. Between her parents, the child, mulatto, returning backwards, cannot slip their hold. The triptych their bodies make, in paint, in blood, her name, written down in the book of castas, all her kind, in thrall to a word. So I mentioned yesterday that my father is also a poet, and he's been writing poems about me my whole life. And I think also anticipating with happiness me becoming a poet, but also with a good measure of dread because he knew that I would set the story straight. This next poem makes use of a line from one of his poems. It's after a chalk drawing by J.H. Hasselhorst, 1864. Knowledge. Whoever she was, she comes to us like this. Lips parted, long hair spilling from the table like water from a pitcher, nipples drawn out for inspection. Perhaps to foreshadow the object she'll become, a skeleton on a pedestal, a row of skulls on a shelf. To make a study of the ideal female body, 4 men gather around her. She is young and beautiful and drowned, a Venus de Medici risen from the sea, sleeping. As if we could mistake this work for sacrilege, the artist entombs her body in a pyramid of light, a temple of science over which the anatomist presides. In the service of beauty, to know it, he lifts a flap of skin beneath her breast as one might draw back a sheet. We will not see his step-by-step parsing, a translation. Mary or Catherine or Elizabeth to corpus, areola, vulva. In his hands, instruments of the empirical, scalpel, pincers, cold as the room must be cold, all the men in coats trimmed in velvet or fur, soft as the down of her pubis. Now one man is smoking. Another tilts his head to get a better look. Yet another, at the head of the table, peers down as if enthralled, his fist on a stack of books. In the drawing, this is only the first cut, a delicate wounding, and yet how easily the anatomist's blade opens a place in me, like a curtain drawn upon a room in which each learned man is my father. And I hear again his words. I study my crossbreed child, misnomer and taxonomy, the language of zoology. Here he is all of them, the preoccupied man, an artist, collector of experience, the skeptic angling his head, his thoughts tilting toward what I cannot know, the marshaller of knowledge, knuckling down a stack of books, even the dissector, his scalpel in hand like a pen poised above me, aimed straight for my heart. When I started working on this book and looking at the Costa paintings, I wanted to make sense of the particular historical question that I'd asked myself. And at that point, I was thinking about our present moment and wondering how far back I could go to find images in paintings about the deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference that many of us carry with us today, and that manifest themselves not only in the public discourse, but sometimes in the very intimate and loving discourses within families. And so the 18th century was an easy place to go, but I thought surely there must be other places to find this. And I remember coming across a book on my shelf called The Panorama of the Renaissance, and finding a chapter about race in the Renaissance, and seeing for the first time a Miracle of the Blackleg painting. The Miracle of the Blackleg paintings appear across several centuries. The myth itself began around the 12th or 13th century as a written narrative in Greek. There are the pictorial representations that started around the 14th century up until about the 17th century. In many countries, there's even a Scottish poem about the Blackleg. Cosmas and Damian are the patron saints of medicine. They were performing the miracle plant transplant, which always involved the leg from a black donor being given to the body of a white recipient. Miracle of the Blackleg. 1. Always the dark body hewn asunder. Always one man is healed, his sick limb replaced, placed in the other man's grave. The white leg buried beside the corpse, or attached as if it were always there. If not for the dark appendage, you might miss the story beneath this story. What remains each time the myth changes. How, in one version, the doctors harvest the leg from a man 4 days dead in his tomb at the church of a martyr. Or, in another, desecrate a body fresh in the graveyard at St. Peter in chains. There was buried just today an Ethiopian. Even now, it stays with us. When we mean to uncover the truth, we dig, say, unearth. 2. Emblematic in paint, a signifier of the body's lacuna, the black leg is at once a grafted narrative, a redacted line of text, and in this scene, a dark stocking pulled above the knee. Here, the patient is sleeping, his head at rest on his hand. Beatific, he looks as if he'll wake from a dream. On the floor beside the bed, a dead Moor, hands crossed at the groin, the swapped limb white and rotting, fused in place. And in the corner, a question, poised as if to speak the syntax of sloughing a snake's curved form. It emerges from the mouth of a boy like a tongue, slippery and rooted in the body as knowledge. For centuries, this is how the myth repeats. The miracle in words or wood or paint is a record of thought. 3. See how the story changes. In one painting, the Ethiop is merely a body, featureless in a coffin, so black he has no face. In another, the patient at the top of the frame seems to writhe in pain, the black leg grafted to his thigh. Below him, a mirror of suffering, the blackamoor, his body a fragment, arched across the doctor's lap as if dying from his wound. If not imminence, the soul's bright anchor, blood passed from one to the other, what knowledge haunts each body, what history, what phantom ache? One man always low, in a grave or on the ground, the other up high, closer to heaven. One man always diseased, the other a body in service, plundered. 4. Both men are alive in Violdo's carving. In twinned relief, they hold the same posture, the same pained face, each man reaching to touch his left leg. The black man on the floor holds his stump, Above him, the doctor restrains the patient's arm as if to prevent him touching the dark amendment of flesh. How not to see it? The men bound one to the other, symbiotic, one man rendered expendable, the other worthy of this sacrifice. In version after version, even when the Ethiopian isn't there, the leg is a stand-in, a black modifier against the white body, a piece cut off, as in the origin of the word comma, caesura in a story that's still being written. So there's a lot of parsing going on in this book, a lot of dissections of actual bodies, the dissection that happens, the parsing that happens with the language, the taxonomies that we create. And of course, it was perhaps Thomas Jefferson who first called for a kind of comparative anatomy. He wanted to see scientists cut the Negro open in order to determine the essence, the origin of what Jefferson believed to be black inferiority. There were some anatomists who did this kind of work. This is Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright on dissecting the white Negro, 1851. To strip from the flesh the specious skin, to weigh in the brain pan seeds of white pepper, to find in the body its own diminishment, blood deep and definite, to measure the heft of lack, to make of the work of faith the work of science, evidence the word of God, Canaan be the servant of servants, thus to know the truth of this derelict corpus, a dark compendium, this atavistic assemblage, flatter feet, bowed legs, a shorter neck, so deep the tincture. See it? We still know white from not. I should make a nice joke here to have some levity. See, this is the problem, Miles, with having that great dance party before, and then you have to come and hear me. I'm kind of grave, so I can be a drag, but bear with me. Mano Prieta. The green drapery is like a sheet of water behind us, a cascade in the backdrop of the photograph, a rushing current that would scatter us, carry us each away. This is 1969, and I am 3, still light enough to be nearly the color of my father. His armchair is a throne, and I am leaning into him, propped against his knees, his hand draped across my shoulder. On the chair's arm, my mother looms above me, perched at the edge as though she would fall off. The camera records her single gesture. Perhaps to still me, she presses my arm with a forefinger, makes visible a hypothesis of blood, its empire of words, the imprint on my body of her lovely, dark hand. I like to think of this poem as my response to the help. It's after a photograph from this series, The Americans, by Robert Frank. Help, 1968. When I see Frank's photograph of a white infant in the dark arms of a woman who must be the maid, I think of my mother and the year we spent alone, my father at sea. The woman stands in profile back against a wall, holding her charge, their faces side by side, the look on the child's face strangely prescient, a tiny furrow in the space between her brows. Neither of them looks toward the camera, nor do they look at each other. That year, when my mother took me for walks, she was mistaken again and again for my maid. Years later, she told me she'd say I was her daughter, and each time strangers would stare in disbelief, then empty the change from their pockets. Now I think of the betrayals of flesh, how she must have tried to make of her face an inscrutable mask and hold it there as they made their small offerings, pressing coins into my hands. How, like the woman in the photograph, she must have seemed, carrying me each day, white in her arms, as if she were a prop, a black backdrop, the dark foil in this American story. I'm going to read just a couple of elegies for my mother that appear in my previous collection, Native Guard. And this is a poem that relies a little bit on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, particularly because there's a couple of dreams that I have about my mother. And if you've lost someone, perhaps you have dreams like this too. In one kind of dream, I know that my mother is gone, and so the dream feels like a lovely visitation, and I wake up happy, feeling that I have had a chance to talk to her. In the other kind of dream, I don't know that anything has happened, that she's gone, and so there's always a moment of waking up, rolling over, opening my eyes, and realizing that she's dead, which must be not unlike what Orpheus felt when he couldn't resist turning around and banishing Eurydice back to the underworld. Myth. I was asleep while you were dying. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow I make between my slumber and my waking, the Erebus I keep you in, still trying not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow, but in dreams you live, so I try taking you back into morning. Sleep heavy, turning, my eyes open, I find you do not follow. Again and again, this constant forsaking. Again and again, this constant forsaking. My eyes open, I find you do not follow. You back into morning, sleep heavy, turning. But in dreams you live, so I try taking, not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying, I make between my slumber and my waking. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow. I was asleep while you were dying. Bird in the house. A gift, you said, when we found it. And because my mother was dead, I thought the cat had left it for me. The bird was black as omen, like a single crow meaning sorrow. It was the year you'd remarried, summer, the fields high and the pond reflecting everything, the willow, the small dock, the crow overhead that, doubled, should have been an omen for joy. Forgive me, Father, that I brought to that house my grief. You will not recall telling me you could not understand my loss, not until your own mother died. Each night I'd wake from a dream, my heart battering my rib cage, a trapped wild bird. I did not know then the cat had brought in a second grief. What was it but animal knowledge? Forgive me that I searched for meaning in everything you did, that I watched you bury the bird in the backyard, your back to me. I saw you flatten the mound, erasing it into the dirt. This next poem is another Costa painting poem. It's called torna atrás, which means return backwards. From albino in Spaniard, a return backwards is born. And I just need to make sure that you know that the figure of the albino or albino in these paintings is a very white-skinned figure, but someone who has the taint of blackness somewhere. So whereas they look very white, they are not. This is by an anonymous painter circa 1785 to 1790. Torna atrás. The unknown artist has rendered the father a painter, and so we see him at his work, painting a portrait of his wife, their dark child watching nearby, a servant grinding colors in the corner. The woman poses just beyond his canvas and cannot see her likeness, her less than mirror image coming to life beneath his hand. He has rendered her homely, so unlike the woman we see in this scene, dressed in late century fashion, a chicador, mark of beauty in the shape of a crescent moon affixed to her temple. If I say his painting is unfinished, that he is yet to make her beautiful, to match the elegant sweep of her hair, the graceful tilt of her head, has yet to adorn her dress with lace and trim, it is only one way to see it. You might see, instead, that the artist, perhaps to show his own skill, has made the father a dilettante, incapable of capturing his wife's beauty, or that he cannot see it, his mind's eye reducing her to what he's made, as if to reveal the illusion immanent in her flesh. If you consider the centuries' mythology of the body, that a dark spot marked the genitals of anyone with African blood, you might see how the black moon on her white face recalls it. The rosita she passes to her child, marking him torna atrás. If I tell you such terms were born in the Enlightenment's hallowed rooms, that the wages of empire is myopia, you might see the father's vision as desire embodied in paint. This rendering of his wife, born of need to see himself as architect of truth, benevolent patriarch, father of uplift, ordering his domain. And you might see why, to understand my father, I look again and again at this painting, how it is that a man could love and so diminish what he loves. Rotation. Like the moon that night, my father, a distant body, white and luminous. How small I was back then, looking up as if from dark earth. Distant, his body white and luminous, my father stood in the doorway. Looking up as if from dark earth, I saw him outlined in a scrim of light. My father stood in the doorway as if to watch over me as I dreamed. When I saw him outlined, a scrim of light, he was already waning, turning to go. Once he watched over me as I dreamed. How small I was. Back then, he was already turning to go, waning like the moon that night, my father. Fouled. From the next room, I hear my father's voice. A groan at first, a sound so sad, I think he must be reliving a catalog of things lost. All the dead come back to stand ringside, the glorious body of his youth, a light heavyweight, fight ready and glistening, that beauty I see now in pictures. Looking into the room, I half imagine I'll find him shadowboxing the dark, arms and legs twitching as a dog runs in sleep. Tonight, I've had to help him into bed, stumbling up the stairs, his arm a weight on my shoulder so heavy it nearly brought us down. Now his distress cracks open the night. He is calling my name. I could wake him, tell him it's only a dream, that I am here. Here is the threshold I do not cross. A sliver of light through the doorway finds his tattoo, the anchor on his forearm, tangled in its chain. I'm going to finish up with 3 poems now. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning. Drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us. Everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places. You upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed. On happiness. To see a flash of silver, pale undersides of the maple leaves catching light, quick movement at the edge of thought, is to be pulled back to that morning, to the river where it flashes still. A single fish breaking the water's surface, the almost caught taunting our lines until we give up at last and turn the boat toward home, is to see it clearly, the salmon rolling, showing me a glimpse of the unattainable, happiness I would give my father if I could. And then is to recall the permit he paid for that morning, see it creased in my back pocket, how he'd handed it to me, and I tucked it there as if a guarantee. My father took me to Monticello over 20 years ago. And for that long or longer, we've been talking about Thomas Jefferson, disagreeing about some things about Thomas Jefferson. Of course, I should have mentioned yesterday, but I said this phrase to someone else: we know that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can still love Jefferson, even as we are acknowledging Jefferson's complexities. Well, a lot of things have changed at Monticello since I first went there. I knew that to finish this book, I had to take my father back there. And so it is now the official position that at the Jefferson Foundation that he fathered Sally Hemings' children. And the docent will tell this to you when you take the tour. Of course, because of that, the conversations at Monticello changed. And now you hear people speculating about how white she was. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it. This history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.